Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Recently, I've seen some advertisements for an upcoming Kickstarter project that is a Call of Cthulhu game for the Daggerheart system that is set in like 1912. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And I put up just a post a little while ago just asking if there would be any sort of interest in me talking about, a scenario that I was working on for Call of Cthulhu that was taking place in the early 1900s. And one of the things with this new Kickstarter that's going to be coming out, Heart of Cthulhu, I think it's called, or something like that. But it features the Titanic prominently on at least one of the covers of the books involved. And I was going to run a scenario involving the Titanic as well. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting to sort of talk about it. Now, again, I never published the scenario. I ran it for a group of 4 people. So I'm not going to pretend that they're stealing the idea from me or anything, or that it's even, all that unique an idea to take Call of Cthulhu and set it in different time periods and different historical events. It's just one of those things where it's an interesting coincidence that, all these years later, somebody's actually doing it and they're gonna do some crowdfunding for it. So I hope it does well. I'm not personally interested in it just because I was going through my collection, and as far as different editions of games and different, products that I own, I have the ability to run at least a single session for 50 plus role-playing games. So I'm just really not looking to add too many more new ones to my collection. So I'm not super keen on Daggerheart, but I hope it does well. It seems people seem to enjoy it. So that's awesome, but it's just not for me. Anyway, I want to talk about my Call of Cthulhu crossover with, the real-world event that was the sinking of the Titanic, and just sort of what my plans were for that campaign, although I might not reveal too much because the door, I think, is always open to potentially return to that scenario or to jump back in at a later point in that scenario, so I don't know how much I really want to give away. But the scenario began in early 1911. So it took place a year, more than a year before the Titanic, thinking that might, throw people off. But, the people in the group know me, so they know exactly where this was going to be going anyway. But it's fine. A sinkhole had opened up in the countryside outside of London. And inside of the sinkhole, the back end of it, was this stone arch and stone doorway made out of this weird green and black stone with these strange carvings and runes etched into them, and these strange patterns that are kind of carved in them, geometric and just bizarre kind of looking patterns. So one of the authorities from over in England contacted an NPC that all of the characters we're going to have some connection to. I forget what every character was. I know that one of the characters was the professor's name was Professor Farnsworth, and I would love to say that was my, nod to Futurama, because of, Hubert Farnsworth. I really want to say that because, that's more clever than me completely forgetting that Futurama existed and then going online to a name generator and just putting in early turn of the 20th century, fancy sounding names, and that was the one on the list that was the most interesting to me, so that's the one I went with. But yeah, so Professor Farnsworth was a former professor at Miskatonic University. He specialized in history, but he started kind of leaning towards these really fringe theories about an entire intelligent species that existed before man, and sort of all these occult things, before he ultimately ended up kind of being asked to retire early type of situation. But he was an authority on the bizarre and the occult, so he was one of the people that would make a natural choice to come and investigate this bizarre, not inhuman looking doorway type of thing. So one of the characters was sort of a rich noble, came from a wealthy family, and he was the professor's godson. Another one of the characters was I think he was a former high school football player, turned into a reporter, I think. and one of them was like an investigative, a private investigator, I think was another one of the characters. I kind of forget what they all were, but I do know that one of them for sure was a sort of like a gentle giant type of character, and then the other was sort of a bit smarmy, but he was Professor's godson, so he came from wealth and had a very comfortable upbringing type of situation. So I had them board I think it was the Adriatic, and make their way across the ocean from New York to Southampton, where they would catch a train into London and then go out to the sinkhole from there, sort of thing. While they were getting ready to board, they noticed some unusual looking or sort of suspect looking people that seemed to be paying very close attention to them. And over the course of the voyage, these individuals kept trying to take out the player characters. One individual was poisoned; their food was poisoned, and he had to go to the ship's surgeon, which is what the doctor was. They were called the surgeon. But the surgeon was replaced by one of these, evil cultists that tried to stab the character and kill him, only to have the dagger wrestled from him by again the sort of like gentle giant character, who held the knife out in front of him like menacingly to tell the surgeon to step back, only to have the surgeon walk into the blade throat first and just like take himself out then and there. That same character, unfortunately, also found another one of these individuals that was observing them, and when he tried to tackle him so that they could question him, they were near a set of stairs going from like the A deck down to B deck sort of thing, or maybe B deck down to the forecastle. I forget exactly. It's been a few years, but he went and he tackled him, but he rolled like a crit, and he rolled so high, and his character was so beefy and heavy that he ended up just coming down, and they tumbled down the stairs, and all of his weight ended up on the guy's neck, and it killed him. So this poor, like, former football player, sweet, gentle giant character was now responsible for 2 deaths. But also, while they were on board, they started getting these weird premonitions that they would experience. So one of the characters could keep hearing this like melodic tone kind of repeating over and over and over again. And because he was wealthy, and because he was kind of like, academic and, maybe a little bit on the nerdy side for early 1900s, and would have probable access to this sort of technology, he was aware that it was Morse code for the Marconi wireless system. And that, the tone came from a very, like, powerful system, and he was able to, after hearing it enough times, he was able to decipher some of what it was, because there was a lot of different like signals that were kind of coming through and kind of blurring things, but he was able to decipher the letters MGY, CQD, and SOS, and recognizing CQD as the standard distress call for the day, and recognizing SOS as the newly adopted but barely used as of now distress call, and knowing that MGY would have been the call letters of a ship, but he wasn't sure which one it would be. It was just a ship in distress. Then the other characters would have dreams, nightmares, as they were sailing towards London. So one individual, in his dream, he was standing on sort of like a higher elevation, looking down, and he saw these 4 people in robes, and they had this strange book that they had opened, and he could hear chanting, but he couldn't quite decipher what was being said. And all that he knows is that the moon disappeared, and the next thing he sees is this giant clawed hand, the size of a house, basically, swiping towards where he's standing. And he could hear the sound of like metal scraping and ripping apart type of sound, and it was horrifying. And he woke up. Another character, the professor's godson, had a dream where he was looking up at his godfather, the professor, who had this rectangular object in his hands that he passed over to the player character as the professor starts to sort of ascend up and up and up and up into the point where like he could no longer be seen. And he could hear like the sounds of murmuring, he could hear the sounds of crying around him, but he wasn't quite sure, like he couldn't see where he was or what he was doing or what even the object was that was being passed to him. Only that he knew it was a large, heavy, rectangular object, and that his uncle started going, or not his uncle, his godfather started going, ascending and ascending and ascending until he was out of sight. Another one of the characters would be basically had the sensation of falling, and the sensation of falling was broken up by the feeling of being stabbed by 1,000 daggers all at once. And then another character found themselves in a sitting position in their dreams, and they suddenly got very, like, a sensation of very, like, wet and very cold, and then they believed themselves to be sitting in some sort of sarcophagus, and when they looked up, the lid of the sarcophagus was descending down upon them, and they could hear the screams of, a couple of dozen individuals, but again, couldn't distinguish anything that was being said. And then another character, the last character, I believe, they found themselves standing on a very shaky surface, so they had to continuously adjust their balance. But they looked ahead and they saw this plateau of skulls, this large pile of skulls that formed almost this large, like, rectangular object off in the distance. And he saw a pair of these, like, molted flesh, green, rubbery hands emerge from the inky blackness underneath the skulls, and then wrapped its hands around the skulls and then snapped the pile of them in two, with the first pile in the right hand disappearing into the darkness, while the one in the left hand kind of dropped back down to almost level before it too slowly disappeared. All that happened after that was the sounds of 1,000 voices crying out all at once for help and for mercy, only to slowly slowly fade away until it was just a deafening silence, and then the characters would wake up. When they reached England, they, shaken by their experiences, they made their way to the sinkhole. Nobody had been able to figure out what was going on with this arch and this door, these weird stone doors. The professor recognized some of the runes and began tracing them with his finger, and suddenly the doors slid open. And, the door slid as if they were going into something, but the archway wasn't wide enough to fully conceal the door, so these were opening, but the other side of them wasn't coming out on the other end of the arch. So it was very bizarre. And there's just a shimmering barrier where the doors were, and he stepped through, and then the players stepped through. And they found themselves in just a long hallway, like a T-shaped hallway, and they would see these strange patterns on the walls, these strange carvings of bizarre, creatures. The apparent, it was hard to decipher kind of what they were seeing, but there was an intersection where straight ahead was an image of a person holding this undefined rectangular object in this undefined triangular object. And then there were doors to the left and to the right, or to the east and west, or whatever you want to call it there. When they went into one room, they found themselves stepping in a room that appeared like they were walking on the surface of water. There were stars on the ceiling, but there was no moon. And there was this icy hand, or this icy platform, upon which rested a dagger. And the dagger was very elaborately carved. It was made, the handle of the dagger was made out of a similar green material to what the stone door was. But it would kind of pulsate when somebody picked it up and grabbed it. The green stone, the green and black stone would kind of pulsate. So it were like the green veins, for lack of a better term, in the black stone would pulse as somebody held this dagger. And then the ice shelf descended into the water. And then they went into another room where they found themselves in, I think, a strange city with buildings that had like impossible angles and all these other things. And they saw these two hands kind of arrayed like this, sticking up from the ground, and they were holding a book. And when the professor grabbed the book, then the hands kind of disappeared into the ground as well. And then when they made their way back out into the intersection again, the figure on the wall, the mural that was holding those undefined objects, was suddenly holding the book and the dagger. And then that opened up, and they were able to step through another shimmering barrier, where they found themselves back in the sinkhole. But it was nighttime now, and there was nobody around, and there was like some tape and stuff to kind of block everything off that wasn't there before. And as it turns out, they had lost months and months of time. So, like, months had passed, and we were now getting into March of 1912. The professor became very distant from everybody else during this period of time, and eventually they had passage booked to go back to New York. And again, I think they were booked once again on the Adriatic. However, this was during the middle of the coal strike and the coal shortage, the coal worker strike, and a shortage of coal. So a lot of ships were canceling their crossings and transferring passengers to other, like, larger ships that were more readily available. And so these characters found themselves, or they were going to be on the Titanic. Now, I never got to run this portion of the scenario, but basically, on the night of the 14th, actually, it would be the morning of the 13th, or late at night on the 13th. They would all have the dream of seeing these four robed figures holding a book similar to the one that they found, and chanting this ritual, which would cause the moon to disappear. And as it turns out, that was setting up for what would happen the following night. So, the Titanic would strike the iceberg, and then the dreams that the characters were having on their way to England would start to come true. So, I mean, you wouldn't be able to hear the wireless or anything, but that was just kind of to set up that something was going on. However, the character, the godson, the professor's godson, where he had the dream of being past this rectangular object, while his godfather ascends, into the heavens or whatever. What it actually turns out was, because he was, first class, he was on the starboard side of the ship. Women and children first were called for. When no more women or children were around, the professor was able to convince the workers or the crew members to allow his godson to step on the lifeboat. So this character was able to get on the lifeboat, and his godfather passed him the book and just said, "Keep it safe." And then instead of the godfather ascending, what it actually was is the character was lowering. He was lowering down into the lifeboat, but he got off the ship and he was safe, and he didn't have to worry about anything. The character who found themselves falling before being stabbed 1,000 times was one who wasn't able to get into a lifeboat right away, though he would be picked up later on. But basically what happened was he had to jump, and there was the falling sensation, and the water was so cold that, I forget, was it Archibald Butt? Described it as being stabbed, like just 1,000 knives being plunged into one's body, was the description. So I took that literal description and made sure to use it as like the dream, and then it made more sense when he was plunged into the icy cold water. So that was his situation. The character that viewed the plateau of skulls that was broken apart, so he was on Collapsible B, which was on which wasn't launched properly. As they were trying to get the lifeboat ready, they had to get it off of a rooftop down to the boat deck, and it just fell down, and it was upside down because it was capsized. The bottom of the boat was facing up, and there were people who clung to that lifeboat that were able to keep themselves on it and keep themselves safe. And this character would find himself in the water, but able to find the lifeboat and use that. But he would witness the ship breaking in two. So he would witness the breakup. The character that was sitting in the sarcophagus before feeling cold and wet with the sarcophagus lid closing on him, he was in lifeboat 13, which very famously was, as it was coming down, it got caught up in the condenser discharge of the Titanic. The condensers are used to turn the steam back into water, so they go back into the boilers and kind of be useful that way. by using like the seawater to cool the steam as it's coming back towards where the boilers were. But that seawater gets discharged, and I think the pumps were even discharging through that outlet as well. So when Lifeboat 13 came down, it got hit by the condenser discharge, which pushed them backwards, and it pushed them directly under lifeboat number 15, which was lowering down on top of them. And you see this in like the James Cameron movie. You see it in Night to, I think you see it in Night to Remember, but it's kind of one of like the most famous, lifeboat stories from the ship. And so you have like the lifeboat coming down and lowering, and not getting very far, for like getting quite close before they were finally able to cut themselves free from the mooring lines for Lifeboat 13, and they were able to push themselves out of the way. So that was what that character was doing. And then, of course, the sounds of the thousand voices screaming was the voices of those in the water that only lasted for 10, 15, maybe 20 some odd minutes before they started fading out and to the point where it was just eerily silent. And a lot of the survivors, the screaming was horrifying. But it was even worse when the screaming stopped, because they knew what that meant, and they knew that all of those people had passed, and it was kind of this traumatic thing. Frankie Goldsmith, he was a young boy when the ship went down. He lived near a baseball stadium, and he said every time the people would cheer in the stadium, it would give him like this panic attack type of situation. So anyway, that's basically what I had planned. For the Titanic section. It was just going to be like a single session, maybe two, where they're on the ship and they get to enjoy certain things before the sinking happened. I just wanted to have some things kind of be, accurate to like the actual sinking. So we know about the Lifeboat 13 situation and Lifeboat 13 and 15. We know that passengers, first class men were allowed on the starboard side of the ship, as the women and children order had been given. It was perceived as women and children first, and then if there's spaces, then you can get people to, men were able to board. Whereas on the port side of the ship, it was very strictly interpreted as women and children, and that was it. Like, there was no way that a man could get on board unless he was rowing, or if there was no women left on board. So kind of a bit of a interpretation that led to some unfortunate, situations. But anyway, that's just kind of like, what I was going to do, the way that I was going to run it. Like I said, I wanted to incorporate real world events into like the actual like sinking, the timelines of how things like that would progress. So, things like the coal shortage and like stories along those lines, I wanted to incorporate. I don't know if I'll ever actually revisit it or not, so I don't want to go too far into things. But essentially, then this was inspiration from the Eternal Darkness video game. But everything that was happening, like all these tragedies of the early 20th century, even going into modern time, because eventually I was going to transition to like a modern day, early 2000s campaign. And it was going to be discovered that like all of these things were happening as a way of sacrificing souls to Cthulhu in an attempt to finally awaken him and to usher in, the downfall of mankind type of situation. So kind of your standard fare for, the Great Old One's plans. As it turns out, like the cultists that were trying to stop the players from getting to England weren't necessarily the bad guys, because they knew that the player characters were going to be somehow integral in these events taking place. And I'm not going to give too much away, but I will say that it does connect with the missing time situation. And if I decide to go into more detail in the future, I may do a follow-up video. Like if I decide that no, we're probably not going to ever go back to Call of Cthulhu, so I think it'd be okay to discuss kind of ultimately what my plans were. You might be able to guess it, because I'm not like a prolific writer or anything like that. Like I'm not a genius at designing scenarios or anything like that. So like the twist, I'm sure people can probably figure out on their own. But yeah, it was a really great time. I really enjoyed running the setup for that. I just never got around to running the conclusion to it. And around that time, we were doing quite a few different games all at once. And it was just starting to get like really, it was just really starting to take a toll on me. because I think at that point we were doing like Pathfinder, we were doing 5e, then we were doing this Call of Cthulhu game, and it was a lot to try to keep track of or to keep going all at once to do, and it's just something had to give. Or maybe it was second edition AD&D, I can't remember, but we were doing a few different games all at once, and I just didn't have the mental energy to keep doing 3 completely different systems all at the same time and trying to keep it all together. But anyway, so I think it's Heart of Cthulhu is the name of the Kickstarter. I hope it does well. I do hope that if they do involve the Titanic, which obviously looks like they're going to, I do hope that they do research and try to keep things like, you can have the fantastical in there, but like try to make sure that actual historical events are what's taking place. It's not necessarily indulging in kind of the mythos or the mythology that sort of come out of certain things. Like, number one, the Titanic was not trying to break a speed record because it wasn't designed for that. It was physically impossible for it to break a speed record. And when you change, your theories from they were trying to set the Atlantic crossing speed record to, oh, well, they were just trying to beat their sister ship. Like, once you start changing the reason for something, then you're kind of losing credibility. And they just weren't trying to do that. Like, Bruce Ismay was not backseat captaining. He was very much the type of person to stand back and to let the captains run their ships. He was just there to enjoy the crossing type of thing. So it's just kind of things like that, that I hope they don't, wander into too much about, like the things that you see in the movie. The sensationalized ideas, like there wasn't these, gateways in the hallways that, were used to separate third class from everybody. Third class was able to come out on the the stern section of the ship. They weren't allowed on the boat deck right away. But what was stopping them were gateways that went across like handrails. So you could climb over them. Some people did find other places to climb over to get into the lifeboats. So the idea of like these snooty Englishmen trapping these poor immigrants in the bowels of the ship really wasn't true. There's not really any evidence that those types of gates existed inside of the ship. So things like that. I hope that they kind of avoid. I've considered supporting it just to get the book to have a look at it, and I'll think about that. But I don't know how much, I don't know if I'm going to follow through with that or not, just because, again, I'm not going to get Daggerheart. Like, I'm just not interested in adding more RPGs to my collection right now. I've got, like I said, to be able to run, like, a starter set at the very least, or, counting different editions of different role-playing games that I have like 50 different rule sets that I have access to at least run a night's worth of gaming on. And I just don't want to keep adding to that, I'm going to be honest, because there's so many that I'll never get a chance to run now. But anyway, so that was it. That was my involvement with the Call of Cthulhu and the Titanic. So there you go. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever played a Call of Cthulhu game set in a different historical period where the events were orchestrated to help free an old one type of situation? Was one of the world wars a mass sacrifice? Was was Y2K potentially planted by modern day cultists in an attempt to sow chaos into the world, only to be defeated at the last minute by a group of enterprising heroes type of situation? Let me know all that stuff sort of in the comments below. Anyway, thank you all so very much for your time. I truly appreciate it. Like I said, I think it's called Heart of Cthulhu. When it goes live, check it out on Kickstarter, and I wish it nothing but the best of success. And like I said, I hope it does well. Anyway, thank you again for your time. It means the world to me, and we will see you in the next one. Until then, take care.